Very good. Okay, thanks everybody. Good evening. We're going to call this special meeting of council to order. First, I will ask Mr. Clerk, do we have a quorum?
Patterson. Yes, Mayor Patterson, we have quorum.
Okay, next we have the approval of the addeds. We do have the addition of a couple of delegations and also a new motion. So, and a couple of items of communication. Can I have a mover for the addeds, please? Moved by Councillor Bohm, seconded by Deputy Mayor Neal. All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Okay, are there any disclosures of potential pecuniary interest? Okay, seeing none, then we will move to delegations. So we have two delegations on tap this evening. Just a reminder to our delegations that you have 5 minutes, just like in regular council. So first we have Mary Farrar, who will appear before council to speak to clause 1 of report number 43 from the CAO with respect to the COVID-19 response update, operational and financial impacts. Ms. Farrar, you have the floor.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And thank you, Derek, for setting this up. My camera isn't working, but it's lovely to be able to speak with you all. So I wanted to, first of all, I'll be really quick because I know you're all tired. You've had multi-million meetings. I wanted to, first of all, congratulate staff on that really wonderful, amazing report. And also the mayor on that lovely video yesterday on Twitter about open public spaces. Fantastic. And thank you, too, for the bollards to Ian and Sheila. It's so nice to have the bollards up. I feel I'm almost 80, and my sense of balance isn't quite what it used to be. And I really appreciate being able to ride safely around the downtown, and the bollards certainly encourage that. And so do the double lines with the hatch when the bollards are not there. So just wanted to say a big shout out. Thank you so much. Okay, now what was missing, I felt, from the report and what the mayor addressed in part was with the open public spaces thought yesterday. I'd like to introduce the thought of cycle priority routes. This is something that Roger Healy and I have been working on for 5 years, on and off, sort of in the background. And this is routes on quieter streets or possibly major-ish streets where there is a reduced speed limit and where there is signage saying cycle priority routes, so that these would be streets that could be really wonderful for the 8 to 80s, like the 8-year-old kids and the 80-year-old people like me, who are a little uncomfortable about riding on main arterials like Brock and Johnson. So I would like to suggest a few possibilities for this, just to get around the downtown in a safe way. Like if Mac and Earl could be the east-west, and if the north-south ones could be Victoria going from Union all the way up via Macdonell to the high school, and also Bagot and Wellington because they go right into the K&P Trail. Now, it would be totally wonderful, given this amazing opportunity that COVID-19 is offering, with reduced traffic on all the roads. It's such a great opportunity to get out with grandchildren and children and people of all ages on routes that, you know, would still be usable by cars, but they would be reduced speed, and the kids could get used to riding comfortably with their parents, and the parents would feel then more comfortable about the kids going on their own to the high school from Williamsville, Sydenham Ward, and North Kingstown particularly. But also, those are just my suggestions. Now, what I really would like to suggest is that remembering back to the 2017 public engagement framework that the city supported, that goes from very top-down to very bottom-up, with sort of 5 different methods of getting along with various aspects of society. So it starts with inform as being the most top-down, and then consult, and then involve, and then collaborate, and then empower. And as I see it, city staff and council collaborate beautifully with the downtown BIA, as was obvious in the mayor's tweet yesterday. And I would love to see if the same sort of collaboration could happen with KCAT, because KCAT could do all the legwork and then just bring it all back to council, because although Sheila and Ian are completely wonderful in their jobs, it's a huge amount of work and they have other priorities that they have to deal with. And it would be just a great help to have other experts, do that legwork and then come back and discuss it. So that's just a suggestion, and I'm really, really excited about the possibility of the open streets thing and becoming even more open. So I guess that's all I have to say. I hope it was less than 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mary. It was 4 minutes and 30 seconds. So.
Oh, too bad. Sorry, I
No.
didn't mean to be that long.
It was all good. Well under your 5 minutes. So thank you very much. Are there any questions from council? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on. And again, thanks very much, Mary. So next we will move to our second delegation of the evening. Janet Leroux will appear before council to speak to clause 1 of report number 43 received from the CAO with respect to the COVID-19 response update, operational and financial impacts. Ms. Leroux.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And I want to start by thanking everyone for your dedication to the city and continued work during this difficult time. So just on a personal note, thank you. My name is Jeanette Leroux. I hold a PhD in social epidemiology and health promotion, and I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow at Queen's. And I'm a resident of Sydenham Ward, where I live with my husband and baby boy. And I'm here presenting on behalf of a newly formed group, Kingston Beyond COVID, a response and recovery network for a just and sustainable future. And I want to add to the conversation on reimagining outdoor space as a resiliency strategy for our city during COVID. So next slide. So I don't have to go into it too much, but as a health researcher, I need to say that getting outside is extremely important for health. There's extensive literature suggesting benefits on individual, interpersonal, community levels. And as well are just to echo our public health officials from across Canada suggesting that there are particular benefits to exercise in sunshine during a pandemic with added immunologic benefits. But there exist major issues of equity. So not everyone has access to private outdoor space, nor access to the amenities that were recently opened by the province. So the other major point here is that there's been widespread and enormous changes to the ways that people are living their lives. This is an extensive local existence, and their working and transportation patterns have changed. There's a keen appetite for getting outside. There's increased leisure walking, heavy use of conservation areas and trails, and more people are exploring Kingston on foot. And people have and want to continue following distancing. Current predictive models suggest that we'll have to live with this virus for longer term. So we really have to adapt. So next slide. The question being, how do we create safe public spaces for people to get outside? Safe meaning safety from the virus, so their ability to distance is safe from cars. The other question being, what is under municipal jurisdiction? What can be done in the immediate term? So quick implementation. What's practical is we have urgency, nor time or resources for expensive, time-consuming, high-tech solutions. So simplicity, adaptable to changing and evolving situations. So next slide. There's many examples to be drawn from other Canadian cities as well as around the world, but the idea is simple. We repurpose streets to open up more space for people to get outside while maintaining physical distance. There are many community groups. Mary Farrar mentioned KCAT already, but many groups have been contributing to the development of the Active Transportation Master Plan. We know our city, these people have been reimagining space in our city for years, so we can make use of that wisdom. Specific decision making in very cost-effective ways, building off previous research and consultation, and contributing to transit needs and capacity, contributing to economic recovery, as well as importantly aligning with public health advisories and disease management. So I want to say here that echoing Mary, we were thrilled to see your video yesterday, Mayor Patterson. So next slide. So specific suggestions for Kingston in the immediate term, and what I'm here to talk about today is implementation of a series of quiet or slow streets in each of Kingston's areas or neighborhoods. So the Quiet Street Initiative in Kingston could fit with longer term visions and conversations about major road closures, cycling network expansion, and converting green spaces for public use. And I would love to contribute to longer term conversations in those capacities. Next slide. But for today, focusing on quiet streets and the potential in Kingston for quiet streets as described by the City of Toronto. These are shared spaces to allow local residents to maintain physical distancing within their communities through the installation of signage, temporary barricades to encourage slow local traffic access. And so emphasis on really opening up space for people to walk, run, use wheelchairs and bikes, and just allowing local car traffic. And so what this looks like, just briefly, in other Canadian cities, what's happening, pictured here is Winnipeg, where specific streets have been deemed active transportation routes during designated hours. In Calgary, the city's testing partial road closures. Toronto is rolling out to begin 50 kilometers of quiet streets. Vancouver, 50 kilometers of what they call slow streets, is a similar thing, rolled out over the next 2 months. Montreal also has a very robust pandemic plan, which includes 88 kilometers of streets that are being redesigned for pedestrians and cyclists, the pedestrianization.
I'm just going to jump in
sorry.
and just let you know you got about 30 seconds left.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. So internationally, there are lots of examples as well. Happy to go into those. So boiling it down, next slide, to our local context, the idea is to go for closed streets, quiet streets, pedestrian promenade, whatever the version in each ward. Approaches neighborhood to neighborhood. There's several prioritization schemes to draw from and use our existing plans to inform the most impactful installations to keep costs down, keep it simple, work with existing resources, etc. We can look to construction style measures as a great example of flexible and immediate solutions.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jeanette. I think what I'll do now is I'll just pause there and just ask if there are any questions from council. Yes, Deputy Mayor Neal.
Yes. Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. Are you familiar, and I brought this up in the past, are you familiar with the concept of bike boulevards? I know former mayor of Madison, Wisconsin, some 8 or 9 years ago, came to Kingston and talked about the success of bike boulevards in Madison. And a lot of particularly university cities in the States have adopted the concept.
Yes, I think they're fantastic. I think that those are other examples of ways to address the changes that we're seeing in the needs of the people. And so I would hope to see that other measures such as those like implemented.
I know in Williamsville, we've identified 2 or 3 green streets. I think Frontenac Swan, Albert or Alfred portions might be one, and that would lend itself well, I think, to the concept. Thank you.
Okay, next for questions. Questions only, please. Yes, Councillor Kiley.
Thank you, Mayor Patterson, through you. Thanks, Jeanette, for your presentation. You showed a few examples, or mentioned a few examples, I should say, of Canadian cities who are doing this in response to COVID. Do you know if there's any indication whether or not those projects will stay on permanently, or at least will cycle maybe every season or something? Is it just during COVID times, or are other Canadian cities considering this as a more permanent change in how roads are used?
The answer is yes and no. So I've heard, for example, some places are basically approaching this as like a rapid implementation of already tested, already thought through things. So it's just not as fancy. And certainly I'm sure other places it's sort of introduced as temporary measures. So I guess it just depends on the city, but I think I think that people that are in this area are sort of responding as from like the sustainability perspective, knowing that it's not going away tomorrow. So, but yeah, using sort of temporary measures, and then as needed, sort of designing up, if you will. So starting out simple, and then as needed, sort of making things more permanent depending on how, like kind of dynamic, depending on how the community responds and how things evolve.
Great, thanks. And a second question is, you mentioned potential for each ward to have an area like this. Any thought to what criteria would go into deciding where in each ward? Would it be similar across the city, or would different areas have different streets shut for different reasons?
I think this is a fantastic question, and something that we can model after other municipalities. The beauty of this situation that we're all in together is we don't have to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. So there are different approaches that have been published online, which is pretty remarkable, for how these prioritization schemes are being done in other places. So how candidate locations are being selected, and what this sort of process is for deciding what roads are most impactful, like what sort of, what would be most impactful.
Thank you.
Sorry, just to add to that, one idea is to look at like drawing on the ATMP and the specific areas, like the work has been done, like the research has been put in, the consultation has been put in, and obviously the conditions have changed, behaviors have changed, transportation patterns have changed, but overall we can build on the research that has been done for those specifically designated 13 areas.
Okay, thank you. Next is Councillor Holland.
Thanks, Your Worship. Hi, Jeanette. Thank you for the presentation. So most of what I was curious about has been discussed already. So just a really quick question or a bit of clarification. So for the quiet street model, because we've seen different ideas similar to what suggested, and also we've had a few projects that Place Streets happened a couple years back, and those were very successful as well. That they were more a complete street shutdown. This idea is, correct me if I'm wrong, it's like it's enjoying the shared space for recreational purposes, but with some commuting opportunities as well, not like a semi-closed street, but definitely like routing most commuter traffic that is not pedestrian or cycling away from that area. Just just general thoughts on how that fits in with like overall kind of planning on how people get around.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. So the ways that other cities, specifically I'm thinking about Toronto, has set it up. So they've looked at major road closures for the kind of the mental health benefits, I guess, to get people out so they can do long distances. There's the cycle network expansion. So so many people are going to be cycling, so we need to expand that network. And then there's also the conversion of green spaces. So it's kind of thinking about sort of separate pieces, but how they fit together. So my point today is just picking the low-lying fruit, which is the quiet streets in the neighborhood. So the point being that emergency vehicles still have access, doesn't have to impact transit routes. And it just basically restricts the areas to local traffic only. And it just really makes motorists slow down on the street so that people can spread out and enjoy the space on the streets instead of having the sort of zooming traffic go through, with fewer cars on the roads, like more accidents, etc. So that's really the emphasis, is the low-lying fruit, but it certainly fits within a larger framework of other tasks to promote people getting outside and enjoying outside.
Great, thank you.
Okay, next is Councillor Osterhoff.
Thank you, Mayor Patterson, and thank you for the presentation too. I really enjoyed that too. I do hear you, and I represent obviously the rural community, and I think a lot about there's a lot of biking out here too. I mean, in Glen Burnie, we have one of the largest bike clubs in Canada. So, there's a real passion growing out here for it. But I guess I wanted to make sure, have we thought about how to include the rural area, like including the many people who do work in the city, right? And so we have most of us would say that we need a vehicle to get into the city. And I think that we are having some discussions with the city and how to do that and how to create park and rides and that kind of thing. But I would just want to know, do you have a rural lens as well in how we can join up your ideas in the urban area to how we can be part of that?
Yes, absolutely. I am a proud local girl. I grew up in Harrowsmith, so I always think about the commuting experience and the people that really associate with Kingston and see themselves as Kingstonians, even as they live on the outskirts. Yeah. And so, yes, I have. And I think there are several examples that can be drawn from other municipalities that resemble the sort of geography and et cetera of Kingston. One resource that I was actually looking at this morning is from Better Blocks, and they have some nice ideas for adapting this concept for rural areas. But certainly in terms of thinking about this specific concept, the quiet streets, I think that's really important to look at traffic calming, etc. In the areas where speeds might increase, etc. So really taking that rural lens, looking at, again, still neighborhood by neighborhood, and the specific risks to safety for people that live out there. It's a misnomer to think that everyone has lots of space. There's lots of kind of suburban areas like clusters in the country. So like absolutely thinking about that. And there are several groups. I'm most familiar with KCAT, but they've really put a lot of thought into making sure that the outskirts are included in the thinking of transportation and being outside. So thank you for that comment.
Thank you very much.
Okay, next is Councillor Osanek. Just hold on, Councillor Osanek. Oh, there we go.
Oh, sorry, just click the unmute.
Oh, it's good?
Okay, you're good.
It's good. Okay. Thanks for your presentation, Jeanette. I just wondered, for the cities that you mentioned, I know that you mentioned Winnipeg, you mentioned Toronto, and for the other cities, do you know, did the ideas for quiet streets and their ideas, did it come from councillors like that got it from from residents, or did it come from their city staff bringing it forward to council? Do you know that?
I guess I can't comment on that specifically. In my slide deck, I have two live data sets that I include. One is from Canadian examples, and the other are international examples. And so there's sort of represented here 350 examples of different measures. So just kind of sitting in on some webinars, etc., panels about this issue. I think it sometimes is difficult to differentiate how these things evolve. I think that there's a lot of informality between, like they're not necessarily distinct entities. So sometimes what might look like it's originating like from the top, it's like a really dynamic relationship, like integrated through the city. Like the engagement over the years really serves to benefit these municipalities. So it's difficult as an outsider to really be able to distinguish where the ideas originate and how they evolve and where they bear fruit. But I guess the point being, you know, there's lots of examples to draw from, and people are so forthcoming. These different municipalities are so forthcoming, generous with their time in this busy, crazy time to share and sit on panels. So I think there's a real goodwill of exchange that's possible if we want to learn from other places and kind of dig deep in terms of figuring out like how these things have come about. I'm sure there will be many studies sort of retrospectively that don't necessarily benefit us like in the moment or me answering this question, but yeah, I think that I think the examples from other cities is absolutely opportune and exciting. We can add ourselves to that list of Canadian examples as per the YouTube yesterday.
Okay, great. Thanks. We'll definitely get a copy of your presentation so we can review it more in detail. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Doherty.
Thank you, and through you. Thanks for the presentation. Very interesting and timely with the previous presentation as well with Mary's. The examples, the many examples that we have around the world when they introduce these kind of measures, I'm sure there were some lessons learned, and I wonder if you could share what might have been learned in different areas, what worked and what might not have worked.
Do you mean like in terms of quiet streets?
Yeah.
Specifically? Okay, lessons learned. I think I wouldn't, it's on the spot to distill it down to the most lessons learned. I guess my impression would be the immediate responsiveness to people's needs. I'm like a little bit of a junkie medical historian. So thinking back or looking back on sort of history of pandemics, et cetera, the societies that have been able to most weather pandemics, or the populations are the ones that have been able to harness their resources as quickly and effectively as possible, and to implement like fast countermeasures to bring everyone together. So look for that community cohesion. So that's sort of the spirit in which I research. And the spirit in which I've sort of launched this network and thought of these examples, like the low-lying fruit being the quick countermeasure. So I guess the expediency, the urgency, the resourcefulness. So figuring out what we have, which we know how to do traffic, we know how to do construction. So doing those things right away. The other thing that I would comment, just sort of keeping up with this this media in no sort of systematic way, but keeping up to it on a daily basis, is the inspiration that people draw from it, the hope that it presents to see visual representations of adaptation and resilience on a city level, on a local level. I think it brings people together, and the excitement that has been drummed up in the media is also a key lesson learned for me. So I hope that answers your question.
Right, thanks. So what you also found was like there was immediate uptake by the community.
Yes, yeah. And so I think it's early, like we'll see, like everyone evaluates everything these days. We'll see evaluation, and there is early, there's sort of early process and impact or outcome evaluations for the usage. But I think just anecdotally, like we've seen across the city, the network represents people that live all over the city, and just anecdotally, we've been exchanging how there's just huge upticks in all sorts of behaviors. And we've seen this before in other areas, the uptake in walking for leisure, changes to walking patterns, and massive cycling uptake as well, which is huge opportunity to deal with transit capacity, etc.
Excellent, thanks.
Okay, seeing no other questions. Oh, yes, Councillor Stroud.
Thank you, Your Worship. And thank you, Jeanette, for coming to speak to us. I was wondering if you saw something that I saw yesterday coming out of Toronto, the footage of the Lakeshore Boulevard, which is, I believe, 6 lanes normally, 3 lanes of traffic in each direction. They had put a dividing barrier down the middle, and half of it was active transportation, half of it was cars. And there was a guy that did a count of how many in each of the 2 sides. And in the minute that he counted, it was something like 300 people on the active side and 87, I think, on the of the cars. Just counting the people going by at the same time. I'm wondering if you saw that, and or if you didn't, from my description, if you had any thoughts of why it is the numbers in Toronto would be so startling, unbalanced of that same use of space.
Thank you so much for the question. It's very exciting. My friends in Toronto have been just so excited for this change, and absolutely it's stark. And we see that there's lots of sort of graphic visuals to show how overwhelmingly less space people, pedestrians and cyclists take as compared to single-use vehicles. So, I mean, all that to say, I think that that type of thing, it really deals with the issue at hand, which is people needing to get outside, people needing to have visuals of hope, and sort of the immediacy of getting going with these types of measures and really what's possible.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. And yes, I missed your presentation when it was live, but I will review. Sorry.
I'm just wondering.
I just wanted to say thank you for your input.
Okay.
Oh,
that's
thank
great.
you so much.
Thank you. Seeing no other questions, thank you very much, Ms. LaRue. And with that, we will move on. So we have no other delegations this evening. We do have one briefing. Lanny Hurdle, Chief Administrative Officer, will brief Council with respect to Clause 1, report number 43 from the CAO, again with respect to COVID-19 response update, operational and financial impacts. CAO Hurdle.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. So I do have a presentation. Thank you. I'm not sure if that's you, Janet, but thank you for pulling up the presentation. I do have a presentation for Council tonight. The report that you received obviously had a lot of information. Our intent was to bring you a second update report to COVID-19. You will recall that we brought one earlier in April. This one is a lot more comprehensive in terms of the financial review. The previous one was a much shorter time frame in terms of overview of the financial impact. So we thought that it was important to bring you this information tonight as far as the operational and financial implications that COVID-19 has had on the city itself. So if you could move to the next slide, I would appreciate that. Thank you. So this gives you a little bit of an overview in terms of when the state of emergency was declared in the province and also in the city. I do want to maybe make a few comments for Council. We, from a city perspective, we not only have a responsibility to our corporations. So like many other organizations, we have our own corporations, operations that we needed to quickly move to closures, but we also have a huge responsibility to the community. So there are many aspects of the work that we do that is not necessarily embedded in our day-to-day operations, like working with public health, for example, to set up an assessment center. All of those things took place during the first month. So first month was very much focused on how do we shut down, how do we close certain services, how do we implement measures to make sure people are safe, how do we support public health, how do we support homelessness, how do we support community programs for food. So there are a number of things that we did in the first month and trying to implement all of those things that are well above and beyond a number of the day-to-day services that we had to continue to provide, like our planning, heritage that continued essentially with very little impact except for our public meetings that are now taking place through Zoom. So a lot of that work was done. Our second month obviously was spent more on trying to stabilize some of our operations and looking ahead and trying to plan ahead for our own operations and the financial implications, as well as supporting the community. So what a lot of our focus is on right now is how do we now reopen the community in a safe way? Not only our own operations in terms of services we provide and deliver, because when we return those services online. We have to make sure all the appropriate measures are in place, but also supporting the community in terms of economic recovery and a number of other initiatives, social recovery as well. So the report that's in front of you tonight speaks to the assessment that we've done in terms of looking at our financial impact from essentially March until the end of August is estimated to be about $4 million deficit. We are also bringing to you options on how to address this tonight. So yes, you will have difficult decisions to make. I understand that. Unfortunately, I wish I could tell you it's the last report with difficult decision, but my guess is it's probably not going to be. Because even if we start to reopen, it will not be business as usual for quite some time. Could you go to the next slide, please? So this gives you an overview of the projected revenue loss. So you understand where these numbers are coming from. Obviously, you will note the ones where we have significant impacts, no surprises to transit. As you're aware, we've had to have people be able to board buses through the back doors of the buses. So we're not collecting fares. Parking revenues with very limited use of our downtown parking, it didn't quite make sense at a certain time to enforce. We are currently looking at how do we start to maybe bring back some enforcement in some areas of the city. And of course, recreation and our sports field. So all of our facilities that we've had to close that do not permit, obviously are not, we wouldn't use them for small gatherings. Usually they would be more conducive for large groups. So we have not been able to operate those. So that's a huge loss of revenue. Could you go to the next slide, please? In terms of expenditures, what we wanted to provide you was an overview of where we're also seeing some savings. So obviously with less operations, we're seeing some savings in terms of our fuel. We're seeing savings in terms of utilities. And also we've deferred hirings of any positions that were vacant. We have also put a hold or a freeze on our student hiring. So there are a number of things, difficult decisions we've had to make because we do need to continue to provide service. So it's not that we're not providing any services, but we recognize that we had to make those decisions. You will note that homelessness and childcare both have actually expenditures attached to them. And that's because of the increased level of service that we've had to provide during COVID-19 to respond to some pressures in the community. But we do have provincial funding that's coming in to actually cover those additional costs. Could you go to the next slide? So looking at the bigger picture, if we look at the revenue loss, we look at the net expenditures. We've also accounted for, you'll recall in our last report on COVID, we still had a gap of about $750,000 that we needed to somehow account for, make up for. So we have carried that over. We've also looked at agencies. So our finance team has been in touch with agencies to get a sense of where their financial situation is at. So we've accounted for that based on the information we had at the time. This gives us, this is where we come up with the total of 4 million in terms of expected loss till the end of August 2020. Now, I do want to, obviously are based on assumptions that we've had to make. So for example, we have made the assumption that we would not be able to open up our sports fields for team usage and team bookings this summer. So those are calculated and accounted for in those assumptions. Now, if there were changes, So the first thing is we have made some decisions at the administrative level. Those are related to staffing and salaries. So we have made the decision to freeze all non-union salaries for 2020. So there is no performance-based increases. That's approximately 650,000. And we have also recently issued notification of temporary shortage of work to union and non-union full-time staff. That's equivalent to about $800,000. And that's assuming until the end of August. I can assure you that we worked very, very closely with our QP representative through this process. And we have done a significant number of redeployment and reassignment for our staff before we had to move to this temporary shortage of work. Unfortunately, we're not the only municipality in Ontario that's having to make such decisions. So what's in front of council for council's consideration tonight are recommendations to help bridge the remainder of this financial gap. So we had been working to build some capacity with the education tax room last year and this year. So we do have some flexibility there in terms of our funding. Those two combined are about $850,000. We are also proposing a 2020 budget transfer to working fund reserve that we could use to help support the operations of $400,000. And we are also proposing a number of capital project deferrals and cancellation to essentially be able to leverage the remaining $1.5 million so that we can ensure that we can cover this $400,000 deficit until the end of August 2020. Could you go to the next slide? So in terms of capital projects, deferral cancellation, that's not the entire list. The report, of course, has an exhibit attached that provides for the entire list. But I want to give council an idea of some of the projects that are included in there that are probably more public in nature, in the sense of public use. So we do have a number of initiatives that are listed in there, whether it's within parks, transportation, transit and fleet, that we are proposing to defer in order to gain the financial capacity that we need to make up for this the financial gap that we have. Could you go to the next slide? What we are also proposing is a deferral of some council priorities. And again, we are not proposing to cancel council priorities. We're proposing to defer some of them. That's in Exhibit B of your report. You do have the list of the current timeline and the new proposed timeline. The reasons why we're looking at deferral for council priorities. So there are a number of them. First of all, like I indicated, we have an organization that we're operating above and beyond all the support that we're providing in the community to various initiatives. So we have a number of staff that have been reassigned from these council priorities to respond to other COVID situation or challenges that we've had, or opportunities in some cases. And we had to pull those staff capacity away from those council priorities. We also have our financial capacity, which I've went over earlier. That's a pretty significant one. In some cases, we also have some workplace requirements. So when we're looking at some of the work that Public Works typically does, we have to find ways that we can properly ensure social distancing so that some of this work can be completed. We don't have everything in place yet, and this is why we're proposing some deferrals in some cases. We also have public engagement. So I know we're still conducting some public engagement, but I recognize that COVID-19 has had some impact on how we can do public engagement. We're currently working on alternatives that the community hopefully can support, and we can continue to move some of these initiatives forward. But our initial, until we have these alternatives properly fleshed out and also brought to council for support, we would be proposing to defer some of these initiatives that have significant engagement required. And of course, in some cases, it's just impact on the industry. There are some priorities that are related to tourism, for example. And I think that before we actually continue to move forward with those, we will need to better understand the implication of COVID-19 on the industry. Could we go to the next slide? Some of the other consideration for council, because I want to make sure that we're not assuming that it's 4 million and that's all we have to worry about and then we're done. So a couple of things to flag for council. First is that for 2021, we have a mandate right now from a staff perspective to lower the tax rate, not to maintain it as it is, but to lower it. So we're looking at 1.4% next year, which includes a 1% for capital levy. We have to think about our long-term strategies and also trying to not deplete all of our reserve funds quickly, because 2021 is not necessarily going to be an easier year for us financially. COVID-19 will continue to have impact in terms of our revenues into 2021. We anticipate that our growth assessment for our tax revenues is not going to be as much as we had projected for 2021. We are actually starting to see a bit of a slowdown right now in terms of our planning applications, which, as you know, translated into the construction and then our tax assessment growth. So we do anticipate that that will actually be lower than what we had in the budget. We will need to also think about some of the businesses that may not be operating, or properties where property owners may not be able to pay for taxes in future years. So we need to keep that in mind as well. We will continue to explore opportunities with upper levels of government, but so far conversations are not indicating that there will necessarily be funding for municipalities. I know the comments or the feedback we're getting is that this is being looked into, but as far as I know, there has not been anything formally identified specifically to support municipalities. So I wanted to flag all of those for council. Also the fact that even in 2020, if we're able to reopen some services, I think we need to expect that our revenues are still going to be lower than projected, even if our expenditures go up and we bring back all our staff online. So $4 million gets us to the end of August, but then we still have to think about the remainder of the year. And I can assure you that our team is already thinking about that and working through various strategies on how we can address this. Next slide. So this is just to provide a summary. Like I said, this is until the end of August. We do have some administrative solutions that we have implemented, but that doesn't get us the 4 million that we need in terms of the financial gap. What is being proposed or recommended to council is the use of some reserve funds, the education tax room, as well as deferral of capital projects and some council priorities. And I think I'll move to the next slide, but I believe that's the end of my briefing for tonight, Mr. Mayor, and we'll be happy to take questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So yes, what we'll do is we'll do questions now in the briefing. And then when we move to the report and we put the report on the floor, then that will be the time for comments and discussion. So first questions. Councillor Stroud.
Thanks, Your Worship. Thanks, Lenny. My question is to do with the parking revenues and enforcement. I know this is a moving target and very difficult to have all the variables line up to make a coherent decision, because the province holds the final say on what is permitted and what is not. But it's my understanding that the parking enforcement immunity, or whatever you want to call it, is municipally controlled. So, and we saw from your slide how much money that is. So I guess I'm wondering is where is your thinking about when we might revert back to collecting parking revenue? Because it's clear to me, just from, I'm sure to all my colleagues, that traffic is returning to normal. So therefore, parking demand should be returning to normal. And that is what's happening on the street. And I'm wondering where we are on the parking immunity timing.
CEO Hurdle.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. So I'll get started, and Commissioner Kidd may want to also jump in. So a couple of things. One is I'd like to maybe clarify for council that our parking, the loss of revenue in parking, we're actually pulling from the parking reserve fund. So that's part of the policy that's in place. When we have profits at the end of the year from parking, we usually put it in this reserve fund. And when we have deficit, of course, we're able to pull from this reserve fund. So that is helpful. But to maybe address Councillor Stroud's question is, we are currently working on looking at returning enforcement in some areas of the city for parking. You're correct that with some of the recent changes made by the province, we've seen an increase in terms of traffic and people utilizing parking. So I'm not sure if Commissioner Kidd would like to add to that in terms of maybe more precise time frame.
Commissioner Kidd.
Thank you, and through you, Your Worship. We are starting to think about reinstituting parking regulations, not necessarily across the board, but certainly in the areas that are challenging. I know it may come as a surprise to some motorists, but our primary motivator for having parking regulations is not to generate revenue. It's actually to control the parking supply and dedicate it to those who need it. And that's why we have such a variation of short-term and permits and things like that. What we know is that, yes, there's certainly in the institutional area, which includes the hospital and the university, but primarily around the hospital, the lack of regulations and enforcement in that area has created a bit of havoc, and people are parking for long periods of time in the spots closest, which are by design for motorists who are going to have turnover and usually shorter stays. So we need to consider that. We also know that with the elective surgeries opening up, that's going to create an even greater demand. In the primary and in sort of the downtown core, we get problems with downtown residents who park in short-term spaces, and that will become a problem as the businesses begin to open up and we have long-term vehicles and perhaps even employee vehicles and parked in spaces that are designed for motorists who are coming to do a pickup or do a short trip. The hesitation that we have is related to our ability to manage and provide the level of transit service that we have always been able to provide for the last decade. And so as we start to charge for parking again, we have to be careful, because people who are permit holders, the usage of transit has gone down significantly, but with the restrictions that we currently have for distancing, we are carrying lower capacities and our service levels are lower. So those are the things we're thinking about. I expect that by mid-June, we will be in a position to reinstate at least some areas, and particularly for the metered parking on street and in lots.
Okay, thank you. Oh, yes, Councillor Stroud, you have the floor.
Sorry, I just, that's a follow-up. So yes, the transit use by permit holders, transit pass holders at KGH, it's an understatement to say that it went down. It basically disappeared. I haven't met a nurse at KGH yet who still takes transit. And that's because of the scheduling. The Sunday schedule is not compatible with the hospital schedule. So, I don't know, not having been given a clear answer about when we're restarting normal operations for transit and parking, that question is hanging in the air. And I'd appreciate it if you would update council as soon as possible. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So next on my list is Councillor Bowman.
Your worship, can everybody hear me? Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question in regards to, I know there's a motion coming up at the end of the meeting, and which is going to be looking at different levels of government support and asking for federal and perhaps provincial support. Is there any further information as in regards to that, or are talks beginning around what that level of support could actually look like? Or is this just something where we're casting a net as wide as possible and just hoping somebody's going to throw a couple fish in it? I guess I'm just curious, is there some chatter in the background that this may actually occur? I mean, the province obviously realizes our ability to raise funds is limited essentially to property taxes and a few other little ways, but in the grand scheme of things, we're creatures of the province. So we're really going to need their support. And then federally as well, is there talk at that level? I guess in the background, they will actually show some money to us in an immediate sense so that we can help reduce some of these cash flow issues immediately and then perhaps longer term as well.
So maybe I will start, and then if CAO Hurdle wants to jump in, that would be fine. So Councillor Bone, what I can tell you is that the mayors of the larger cities in Ontario have been meeting fairly regularly over the last few weeks to talk about exactly that. And if I can just frame this for you, we are facing some major financial challenges, but these in Ontario are facing even larger challenges. I think Toronto has already lost $520 million, I think, from TTC revenues. I mean, so there's scale effects there. And I can tell you that all of us are unified in our call to both the provincial and federal governments for some level of emergency assistance. So we are having those conversations. We know that the province and the federal government are talking about it. But as CAO Hurdle has mentioned, there's been no commitment, there's been no detail. We really don't know what to expect. The other piece that I will say, which has been very clear in our discussions amongst the mayors, is that whatever level of emergency funding that may be, we're almost sure it's not going to be 100%. So we know that, cities are going to have to make some tough decisions and, quite frankly, demonstrate to the province and the federal government that, look, we are doing everything we can to find efficiencies, to find ways to reduce costs however we can. That being said, now we're asking for help beyond that. So I think that that's probably the best answer that I can give you based, again, on the discussions that I'm having. And CAO Hurdle may have something to add.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. So the only thing that I would add is that we have of course, either received or received commitment of additional funding in some areas. Obviously, anything that's related to childcare emergency services is covered by the province. Homelessness, we've received $1.4 million to help cover some additional cost. And long-term care, we have now received more details in terms of the additional funding that they're providing for long-term care to help better support all of the service providers. So those right now are the only areas where we either have received dollars or we've received confirmation of additional money to come.
Okay, so we essentially know it's not going to be zero. We really don't know. I mean, we know it's not going to be 100% likely. We can hope, but it's not going to be zero. But the problem is we don't really have a timeline on when additional funds may flow. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's absolutely accurate.
Frustratingly accurate. Okay.
It is. Now you'll see that I have brought forward an additional motion on the addeds. And to be clear, this is basically a motion to endorse the position of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and LUMCO, which together are basically having that call out. But again, we haven't heard anything back. Okay, next on my list is Councillor Doherty.
Thank you, and through you, thanks for your report and the depth of work that went obviously into it. It's you certainly have given us a lot of good opportunities to meet the deficit. But this is all about only till August. So I am a bit concerned about the longer term as well. And you did mention that planning applications, you're already seeing a reduction in that. And I wonder if you could speak to that and what kind of projection you may be hearing and seeing in planning applications.
CAO Hurdle.
Thank you. Through you, I may start, and I think that Commissioner Agnew may have more details around the planning application, but there has been a decrease in terms of the number of applications obviously we're seeing come through. In terms of the building permits, we did see a bit of a spike when the province, if you recall, the province announced it back in I think it was late March or early April that any development that did not have a building permit by April 4th was to be essentially put on hold. So we did see at that point in time a bit of a spike in terms of people coming through and trying to get a building permit quickly to ensure that they could actually do some construction over the summer season, because there were a lot of unknowns in terms of how the construction work was going to unfold over the year. So right now our building permits are showing as being fairly healthy for this year, but I'm not quite sure that that's going to continue on for the remainder of the year. But definitely looking at planning application, there's been a slowdown. Commissioner Agnew may want to add.
Thank you.
Thank you, and through your worship, yes, certainly in the last couple of months, we have seen a reduction in planning applications from what we were projecting for 2020. Probably we're about 50% of what we had projected, and we are seeing, based on what we have coming in terms of potential new applications and communications with applicants about future works they're considering. We are starting to see things pick up a little bit. The last week has shown some optimism of some new people coming forward to say, I'm interested in a project, can I talk to you about it? But it has been a few months of things being slower than what we had anticipated. And therefore we're looking to the end of the year of what that will do from a revenue projection perspective. From the planning perspective, in terms of our cash flow and how it works is we earn the revenue associated with the applications as they're completed. So our ability to earn that revenue is contingent upon finishing those applications and having them come forward to council. So we're looking at all of those pieces from a timing perspective, but are projecting that we are going to finish at the end of the year with less revenues than what we had budgeted for in 2020.
Thank you. And I also wonder if you could speak, or if maybe Commissioner Kidd could speak to transit ridership. I wonder what percentage we're at nowadays.
Mr. Kidd.
Through you, Your Worship, ridership levels have been hovering around 10% at best of our normal. And we've started to see an increase over the last period, but one of the major issues is that we are still working with the physical distancing requirements, which means that sort of every other seat is taped off. So even if we have people, we're still at less than half the capacity of what we would normally carry or be able to carry on any particular bus at any particular time.
Thanks.
Okay, next is Councillor Hill.
Thank you. Through you, Your Worship, a couple questions. I'm just not sure that I entirely understand the room that we are getting from the education tax. Is that money that we're eventually going to have to remit to the school boards, or how does that work exactly?
Yes, Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Mayor. So that is education room. So council will recall when we presented the tax rates for 2019, the final tax rates, the education rates came in actually at about 0% increase. And the province was doing that in part to provide some room to the municipalities that they could use in terms of covering other costs. And in the past, we hadn't done that to any great extent, but in 2019, recognizing at that point some of the risks that we knew were coming with respect to the provincial budget and some of the program changes and funding changes that were going to be coming in 2020, we wanted to be proactive and start putting some monies away. And so we had used enough of that education room that when you looked at the total tax rate between education and municipal, we were still within the 1.5% plus 1% for capital that council had directed as a target. And so that extra room allowed us to create about $500,000 that we were able to put away, staying within that council directed target, and still had enough room that actually the residential was closer to about just over 2% in 2019. Because that room was created in 2019, that changes your tax base. So coming into 2020, we already have that as a new base. And so with some of the assessment changes, we still had about an extra $400,000 from that base in 2020, which again, we put in the 2020 budget as a transfer to the working fund reserve. Again, at the time, thinking we might earmark it for the potential of provincial funding changes. So recognizing now we have a bigger risk with the COVID, we're able to take both those amounts and use them towards the financial gap.
Yeah, thank you, and I appreciate that. I've seen sort of the burgeoning, I guess, tent city that's kind of taking shape by Bell Park. And my understanding was that we planned for, and I saw some of the evidence of that in the presentation that CEO Hurdle gave us, that we had allocated sufficient funding to sort of look after all of our homeless folks and provide accommodation for them. In fact, I think we significantly expanded our accommodation for them. Is that not accurate? Do we not have enough space to accommodate our folks that are currently living at Bell Park?
CEO Hurdle.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. So council will recall that quite quickly after COVID, we moved to implement new location for shelters that could provide individual rooms. So we relocated the youth shelter 2113 Lower Union, which was owned by Addictions Mental Health Services, to provide for single individual rooms. And then we relocated in from the Cole to McLean Court in the East End, which also has individual rooms and has more capacity than the previous shelter. I can tell you that I received some information today that indicates that we're not even at 80% capacity at those two shelter locations. So there is still room. We also opened a what we called a center, if you wish, for people that might be impacted by COVID or needed to self-isolate in the West End. We had 805 Ridley Street. We did make use of it, but it was highly underutilized. We are, with the situation at Bell Park, those individuals have been approached by Street Outreach. We work closely with our partners and offered different options, including shelter, but also other accommodations. We have a number of individuals at this point that are not interested in relocating or going to any of those accommodations. I can assure you that we are working on a plan with our partners. I'm anticipating that we will have a plan by the end of the week that will provide another alternative. We understand that some of these individuals would prefer to be in an environment that is not as structured. So we will provide an alternative, and then we will make sure that there's a period of time to transition individuals to this new service.
Okay, thank you. And then one other, I did get a call, and I guess this goes back to Councillor Stroud's question around the transportation, because obviously there are also essential workers up to now that had struggled to get transportation in at the time that they would begin work. And of course, we're seeing people returning to work in the downtown. So is there a plan to at least have the buses running at a little bit of an earlier time than they currently are?
Mr. Kidd.
Through you, Mayor Patterson. Yes, as a matter of fact, we issued a press release today, and effective Monday of next week, we will be increasing the service hours for transit earlier than 8 in the morning on the express and some of the routes where the demand exists. So it'll start at 6 o'clock, and we'll have extended hours into the evening as well. We're still, we still wouldn't say it's at the Sunday level of service, but it's a modified level of service, but it is definitely an enhancement. It will help people who need to get to work before 8 o'clock, and after work hours will be accommodated, and that will be on a 7-day-a-week basis.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Oosterhoff.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Patterson. And I do just want to say how impressed I am with everyone's work, beginning with our CAO and Lanny Hurdle. You're doing a fantastic job, in my opinion, as I see. I really like how, you know, you've sort of shown the timelines, and you've shown how we get to how we've gotten to where we are, and the decisions to come. And I appreciate it. I mean, we've never been through this before, and you're showing a very steady hand. And I'm not just saying that, but I think as councillors and as people watching, you know, for all our management staff, and of course also our mayor. So I'm very pleased with that, and I like. I know that all wheels are in motion of making the best decisions, and we have a few to make. And I guess my question and my thought pattern is, when do we really look at our strategic plan? At what point does it become a bit of where we have to get serious about that? I mean, we're not quite. Maybe I think we're there, but you know, we know that along this path, we see the losses where we'll be for August, and we know it's probably going to be a little worse by December. So, but at some time or other, we're going to have to look at it and say, in my mindset, it's like we had I don't think it's right to say expansion, but we're a city that's growing and doing things. When will there be a mentality between efficiency, or a definition, I guess, or a clarification between efficiency and contraction, in order to be, as Mayor Patterson said, I think we need to demonstrate that we are doing the right things, and that's kind of what's on my mind, and I think we all are. And so is that what the challenge is tonight, is that we grapple with that, because in some ways as families we all are learning what contraction is going to be, and I think as a city we are demonstrating in many ways really good decision making processes. So that's kind of on my mind. Is that going to be something by August that we think about what we can do less?
CEO Hurdle.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. That is a very good question, Councillor Oosterhoff, and thank you for all the comments. It's been truly a team effort. Everybody's really pulled together on this. In terms of the strategic plan, I think, so for tonight, what is in front of you are deferrals. Some of them are short-term deferrals, other ones are longer term. But I do, to your point, I do think that there would be value, most likely, I'm thinking more in the fall after we start to get a better sense of some of the longer term implications of COVID-19 as we have businesses that are starting to reopen, for council to maybe have a session to review the strategic priorities. Some of the priorities may no longer be as critical as they were maybe a year and a half to 2 years ago in light of impacts of COVID-19. So I think that would be a very good exercise, but I would say the summer is probably a little bit too early. Most likely sometime around the fall, I think we'll have a better sense of the impact, especially on the business community.
Thank you very much.
Okay, next on my list is Councillor Kiley.
Thank you, Mayor Patterson, and through you. I really appreciated how the report was structured in chunks. It made it very discernible and easy to understand. So thank you for that. 2 questions from me right now. One has to do with the Mayor's Economic Recovery Task Force. It was mentioned in the report, and I think we all recognize that it's going to play an important piece in this discussion, but other than being mentioned, it didn't give much detail. So I'm wondering perhaps even Mayor Patterson could speak to that a bit around mandate, who's on it. I recognize some of this has been discussed at council before, but because it was in the report without relationship to some of these decisions, I think more information would be helpful.
So thank you, Councillor Kiley. I'm happy to answer questions about the economic recovery team. So the first thing that I'll say is that the terms of reference, a Q&A about exactly what the team is and what it isn't, and those sorts of documents are all on my website, mayorpatterson.com. The reason why it's not on the city website is it really is more of a community effort. And so the city is a participant, but it's not being necessarily led by the city per se. But what I can share is that there are 10 members of the economic recovery team right now. It's myself, CIO Hurdle. Then we have seven representatives from the 7 sectors that have been hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. And then a thanks to several of you around the table that helped me to choose a representative from labor as well. I think that it was great suggestions that we should make sure that it's very seen that this recovery team is business and labor working together on the recovery. And so we have those, and then we also have Dr. Moore and his team of KFL&A that are special advisors. So we had our first meeting of the recovery team this morning. I think it was a good meeting, kind of hit the ground running, and we're probably going to meet every couple of weeks. So not only will there be reports coming to City Council, but the meetings are streamed on my YouTube channel, and you can actually go in and actually watch the meetings if you want.
Thank you. So in addition to reports coming to council from your group, and sorry, you can hear some neighborhood dogs barking perhaps behind me, Council going to be informed of which recommendations the task force makes to the bureaucracy, then that come to us, so we can kind of understand that relationship a bit more fully. I think, for example, of deferral of taxation for small businesses, likely details will come out from the recovery team. Can you just explain the process a bit more?
Sure. No, absolutely. So the way the team is set up, it will probably look at different solutions, different initiatives, different programs that could be implemented by a variety of organizations. So there could be some recommendations that the chamber may lead, or that the Downtown Business Association may lead, or KEDCO may lead. You're right. I expect there will be also things that will be recommendations to the city. But yes, they would then come as a recommendation from staff, and then it would be up to city council to either say yes or no. And so you can think of, in some ways, the recovery team in that case would be almost like an advisory committee. So they're really kind of helping staff and myself kind of refine and focus what we think are the highest value, highest impact, most effective ways that we can help. But ultimately, it is up to city council, obviously. So when it would come to us, we can debate and discuss. And ultimately, we would either say yes or no to anything that would come to us.
Thank you. That helps me clarify it, and I'm sure others too who had questions about it. My next question is around the transportation bucket in the report. Specifically, one of the line items, CAO Hurdle, that you had in your slide about deferring the study of the electrification of the transit fleet. I'm wondering if you could help me and others understand that rationale a bit. And the reason I ask is because it is only a study. I see it as something, if we're putting off studying, we're putting off acting on it even further down the road. So yeah, if you could talk a bit about that, that would be helpful, please.
CAO Hurdle.
Thank you, and through you, I'll get started. Commissioner Kidd may also want to add to my response. So I believe the deferral that's being proposed about 6 months in terms of time frame in the report. So one of the issues, and I've mentioned this earlier in the presentation, is one of the things we've had to do is pull from our existing staff resources from these priorities to do other work. So if I take transportation as an example, they have been quite busy with shutting down some of the parking. Now we'll be reintroducing parking at some point. That's a lot of work. Also with changes to transit we've had to implement quite quickly. But also I would add to that other initiatives that we're currently working on. For example, with the downtown, looking at street closures. So we are actively working on those, and it's obviously a staff time. It's a capacity issue that we're trying to manage. Commissioner Kidd may want to add to this response.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, certainly agree with everything the CAO has added, but I would add that the other factor at the time was we would need consultants to come into the building, and we need to be able to work closely. We've been working over the last 60 days with limited access and only where absolutely critical. So we did certainly lose a couple of months of time on that, and then coupled that with the resources that we have available to do this work. So the original due date was to complete that study and bring it forward to council at the end of December of this year. And we're simply saying we just need 6 months to be able to make up time. And we will get it presented to council by the end of June of next year.
Thank you. I recognize the challenges that you've described, and lots of good work has been done despite them. I'm wondering, only in follow-up, if when we come together as council to look at the strategic plan, as was mentioned earlier, or to have a more wholesome perspective of what COVID realities look like in the long term, is there an opportunity at that point to reaffirm our commitment to seeing things like the electrification of the fleet happen as soon as possible? In other words, could it be that when we have more information, we could see this happen sooner than 6 months?
CEO Hurd?
Yeah.
I'll give it a start. So through you, Mr. Mayor, I think with this one in particular, I would say even if council was to reaffirm in the fall that you want to move forward, I don't see how we're going to be able to move it sooner than June of next year. It was supposed to be in December. It's being moved to June. Having said that, there are other priorities that where you may want to put more emphasis. For example, food security. I'm thinking that, you know, come fall, for COVID reasons, that one may be a little bit more important and time sensitive. Meanwhile, we have other things such as our downtown center of excellence for tourism may not be as much of a priority considering the impact that we've seen on the tourism industry. So I think there's going to be a number of things that are going to be reviewed, but this one in particular, unless Commissioner Kidd thinks that she can make it happen sooner, I don't think that would be the case. I think that one would stick to the June timeframe.
Thank you. And I would echo Councillor Oosterhoff's adulation. It's been very good work done. And so if you can speed it up, great. But if not, we trust you.
Hey, thank you. Next is Deputy Mayor Neal.
Yes, just to follow up if I can to Councillor Kiley. When we postpone already studies that are in play, like the one on the electrification, which was due to be completed by December, and we bumped it another 6 months. Is there a risk at all that we end up having to spend more money on those external reports after we've already got contracts in place and we're working with consultants? That would be a concern of mine. If somebody could address that, probably CAO Hurdle.
Actually, I see Commissioner Kidd with her hand.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Commissioner Kidd.
Through you, Your Worship. For this particular type of work, I don't see that a 6-month deferral is going to create any significant increase in the cost of having the study conducted. It's a very technical study that needs to understand what type of power we would need to draw based on the number of buses we may want to run, and then what's coming in and into the building and all of those capacity issues. I would remind Council, though, that we do have 2 electric buses on order. And both of those buses were funded through grant funding. We have been notified that we'll have a slight delay of, a few months longer than what we anticipated, because again, even the manufacturers were impacted by COVID, and so some of their operations were slowed down. But we do have 2 electric buses on order. We expect to have them on the ground, hopefully with first quarter of 2021, and we'll get them in operation. So the feasibility study was more about, as we want to expand that number, what do we need to do from a building perspective? And we're not doing nothing. We've had site visits to TTC in Toronto to try to understand just the sheer magnitude of what's required. But this is the technical piece of it. So I don't see any major risk in cost on it.
And will we still be able to have the chargers in place for those 2 buses coming in, and also expansion of our charging ability?
Through you, Your Worship, the grant funding did include a charger for the 2 buses, of course, because they're not much use to us if we can't charge them. So we do have a charger that is part of that work and part of the contract that we've awarded, and it'll support the 2 buses that we have. And again, we have to understand how it actually plays out in reality, but we may be even able to stretch that to get 1 or 2 more buses to be able to charge with that equipment. But anything beyond that is what we need this feasibility study for to understand.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, next is Councillor Chappelle.
Councillor Chappelle, you'll need to accept the unmuting of your microphone on your screen there. There you go.
Geez, I said such prolific information. I don't know if I can go back and repeat it now. Anyways, I have a number of questions with regards to the report. I also appreciate the amount of work and effort that went into it. So, kudos to the staff for doing so. And the questions I have refer to some specific projects. I see that, park work that was anticipated to take place in my district for Max Park and Bert Meunier are being deferred. I understand that, and I'm certain I'll be able to rationalize that, even though there is heightened expectations for this year, that I'll be able to work with my constituents and they'll appreciate that everyone has to put forward some pain. But with regards to sidewalks, I'm just curious if this is impacting Westbrook Road, which is highly anticipated and very, very heated, if this is being deferred to 2021 as well, or if Westbrook Road is still going ahead. So that's my first question.
Yes, Commissioner Kidd.
Through you, Your Worship. I don't believe that Westbrook Road was scheduled for actual construction in 2021. I do not have an answer for that. It was design work that was for 2021 and construction in 2022. As for the rest of the sidewalk work, the rationale for deferring that is simply because at the time, there was no possible way to award that work because of the nature of it requires people to work in close proximity.
Okay. With regards to the RFPs and consultants and whatnot, is it possible to have because they have to, breach the closeness and proximity and come onto the city council? And I realize we've declared this emergency back in March on the 26th. With regards to RFPs being released, is that something that we can report to council before they're released and discussed? Because obviously that's a high stake, high impact cost that we should be looking at and seeing if we can support our staff internally rather than continuing to hire consultants. And I'm wondering if that's something that we can report back to council before decisions are being made.
CEO Hurdle.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. So the RFP that we would release would be RFPs that were already planned for or contemplated. Most of them at this point probably construction in nature. So any other RFP, so we have different ways, different reporting mechanism as well. We do have anything that's below a certain threshold, financial threshold, that is reported to council in terms of award of work. And you get that on a monthly basis. We also have to report to council if we have RFPs where we don't meet our purchasing bylaw, which means 3 submissions. And if we're not selecting the lowest, that does have to come to council. But in terms of the RFPs that are related to the work, the ones that would be connected to the projects that are proposed to be deferred, obviously we would not be issuing RFP for those.
The timeline that we're looking at for this deficit is looking to August. Are we anticipating that the emergency measures, the state of emergency, will be relaxed and we'll be back to making decisions as a full council by August?
CAO Hurdle.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor, I think a couple of things. So I think the state of emergency and the delegated authority that you've provided to the CAO are two separate things. You could choose to remove any authority for the CAO to make any COVID-related decisions right now if you wanted to. I think that was put in place to be able to respond quickly. So for example, if I pick situations we have with homelessness, I can tell you that when we opened up those new locations, we had to respond quickly. So those are the types of situation. You get an update almost on a daily basis in terms of things that are happening or things that we may be changing as it relates to service level that we need to adapt to respond to the changing situation with COVID. So when we increase transit services back, you receive these notifications that are provided almost on a daily basis. So you could choose to do this now. You don't have to wait for the end of the emergency. Keep in mind that if that was the case, we would have to hold quite a few council meetings because there are a lot of moving parts, and there would be decisions that would have to be made that would be time sensitive.
I personally don't have any issue with additional council meetings. I think we should be probably meeting more regularly anyways, but that's.
Councillor Chappelle, can I just jump in? I just wanted to add just one other piece to your last question. If that's okay, and then we obviously have the floor. Just on the state of emergency piece. So one of the things that we did when we declared the municipal state of emergency is that we made a move to do it regionally. So it was myself and the wardens of Frontenac, Lennox, and Edmonton, in consultation with our chief medical officer, Dr. Moore, that we made that decision when we saw community transmission, that we made that declaration. So we are having those discussions now about when would be the appropriate time to lift that state of emergency. But I think that our thinking right now is that we would probably look to do that when the province lifts its state of emergency, and do it at the same time. So I just wanted to just let you know that that's a discussion that's happening regionally, and again with Dr. Moore, if that helps. Councillor Chappelle, you have the floor.
Yeah, and another question I have was with regards to the deferral of the LPAT OMB expenses from Q2 to Q3. I'm wondering, what's really, I understand you're trying to calculate some of the staff costs, but that's really not the issue of concern. The issue of concern is the actual fixed expenses you would have received invoices for. I can't understand why we would continue to defer this request for the fiscal accountability for these OMB and LPAT hearings. I think it's something the public needs to be aware of, because if we're going to consider doing further hearings, maybe we should be cognizant of how much it actually costs to participate in such things. And staff can always be added in Q3 rather than Q2. So that's just a comment question. I'm not sure if you need to respond to that. And I have a final question after that.
CAO Hurdle.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. So I think what we were trying to do is obviously, Councillor Chappelle, we were trying to meet the mandate of the motion, which does include some staff time. We wanted to make sure that we were following the council request and motion. I think we're talking about deferral of a quarter here. So it's something that because we've had some staff, especially on the legal side as well, that have been pulled into multiple other COVID related things, as the province has been changing things quite quickly over the last couple of months. So we've had resources pulled in on other topics and issues, but yeah, we will be when we report back in Q3, it will include the elements that are identified in the council motion.
My final question refers to the fact that a great amount of work has been done to look at ways to shift and move money to ensure improved cash flow and that we're not into a significant deficit, understanding that the regulations underneath the Municipal Act with regards to debt and deficits. The question that I have is, as we progress through this, and if we don't have the opportunity to find this low-hanging fruit factors where we're able to maneuver some room, I think it may be prudent to now look at, if it continues to progress, if it's very difficult decisions to have to be made, rather than forcing this upon staff, maybe it's time that Kingston establish an audit committee that actually makes those difficult decisions and works in cooperation with staff prior to having it come to full council. I just wonder your thoughts on that.
CAO Hurdle.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. So a couple of things. One is that there are still decisions that are within the authority of the administration. So anything related to employees, human resources would not go through an audit committee or would not come to council. those are within the mandate of the administration. That's why there is an administration in place. Anything else would have to come to council anyway. So tonight you're faced with some difficult decisions because it includes deferral of a number of projects and council priorities. Those would still have to come to council because council is the body that has the authority to make those decisions. An audit committee would not have this kind of authority. So the decision making would still come back essentially to council or remain with administration.
And that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next is Councillor Hutchison.
Thank you. A couple of questions anyway. First of all, thank you to staff. It's a good report and for all your efforts in the last couple of months at least. Just one, when we come to looking for money to save, it'll be large items and small items. And so I've talked to staff about this before, and that is the 4-bag limit on garbage pickup. I just don't see why that's necessary, why there's 4 bags. Basically, people are home or were at work or got one extra meal to deal with. And it seems to me if we were, and I thought this was going to be done, given my talk with Ms. Roberts at the solid waste, and it was decided to continue on with it. So I'm kind of wondering what the rationale is here. And it comes in the context also of the questions were about the electric buses and all that, and the fact that climate change is a serious crisis and it hasn't gone away despite this more immediate crisis. So could I get a response to that, please?
Mr. Kidd.
Through you, Your Worship. The original rationale was multifaceted. There was initially, we didn't know what to expect in terms of infections and in terms of additional waste, and particularly waste that might be dangerous for us to handle. That was one thing. There was also a very, very strong message to not travel at all. Like go home, make only essential trips, go to the drugstore, go to the grocery store. The bag tag sales require that you go out, or we are able to process them online, but most people that purchase them do purchase them through our many agencies, many of them being small stores, and many of them only accept cash for those purchases. So there were a number of factors there that we were considering. And so for all of those reasons, but I can say that we have discussed that, and the plan is to revert back to the 1-bag limit by mid-June.
Oh, good. That's good to hear. I suggested at the time, this was 6 weeks ago or so, that 2 bags. I realized there was a tag problem. Where do you purchase them? How do they apply? So I think that's hopefully that's workable, and go ahead with that. My next question has to do with the tax deferral. I mean, we do have to run the city. We have to have resources to do that, funding. So I'm just wondering I read the report. It was in a previous report as well. But I'm just wondering what elements are under consideration. We know the number of people are unemployed, and that affects their cash flow. Is this something we actually ever researched answer on? Who can? It seems to me a lot of people can pay their taxes, and we're going to need it eventually. So, and then a number of people are probably stressed. So do we have any research on that? I mean, where we're at as a community in terms of ability to pay?
Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. So yes, we've got quite a bit of research we do actually on that with other municipalities. I'm on a call every Friday afternoon with the Ontario Treasurers Group, and we compare notes, and that's certainly one of the agenda items that we continue to discuss around some of the tax relief programs. As council's aware, we did defer our June final billing, which would normally be due June 30th. And we're now in the process of looking at what the options are for that. We're looking at a variety of tax relief options around things like deferring further, continuing to waive penalty and interest. But I think, Councillor, your comment was certainly bang on in terms of there are a number of people that can't afford to pay their taxes, that continue to earn the income as always, and should be able to pay the taxes as always. And so what we're looking at now, while for the first couple of months we waived penalty and interest on any outstanding 2020 interim bills, before we issue the final bill, we really want to start targeting tax relief programs to those that need it. So for example, we know that we've got a lot of small, medium-sized businesses that are struggling. And so how can we create a program that will target those specifically? So we're also looking at a application-based process, which is something that Ottawa did for their interim billing and are continuing to do for their final bill. And so that's another option that we're looking at. The timing varies a little bit because our timelines are quite different from a lot of other municipalities. So other municipalities don't bill until later. And so we're one of the first ones in terms of billing a final bill. So we're at the head of the pack. But we're continuing to have those discussions with the treasurer so that we'll try to have some consistency around what tax relief programs we end up with.
Thank you. I want to make clear that I'm in favor of tax relief, and I know businesses are in a bad way often, where it's COVID related. I just realized that eventually we have to collect the money necessary to run the city. So I just wanted some more information on that. Another question is, in the report, it references the issues of assessment, increased assessment, and planning. And I suspect staff has done this, but we want to encourage construction and building and all that, as long as it's safe, of course. So I wondered if we did any kind of cost benefit analysis on ways to speed applications through our planning process. I don't want to drop the necessary requirements or anything like that, because that often protects the community. But would it matter if we actually took on expense to hire consultants so that next year we're in a better position to proceed when it's appropriate? That's my question.
CAO Hurdle.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. So some of my colleagues may want to add to my response. So the first thing that I want to mention is we have continued our planning and building inspection without any significant interruptions. We know a number of municipalities did put on hold, for example, their planning committee meetings for a period of time. Some of them probably have not started them again. So we have been able to continue to accept applications because, as you know now, this is done online. There's a submission online. We've been able to continue the reviews and to move files through the process. I think what the report notes is not so much that the city has had to delay construction because of COVID, but rather two things. One is the province for a while did put obviously a stop to certain types of construction. And also we have seen a reduction in terms of what's coming from the industry. We have been continuing to process things as we normally would. We've just seen a reduction in terms of the interest.
Okay, so it relates back to the business interest in doing things, the uncertainty in the economy and that has sort of made a natural, quote unquote, natural adjustment. Okay, because you can see where I was going. It was more about preparing and trying to make up lost time in next year because it's going to affect our budget, well, going forward. Okay, so, and I did think that the planning committee could maybe meet more often. Hope I got the attention of Councillor Hilda. To do that. So, but I realized that if without staff capacity, that's why I suggested consultants. That you can't really do that. So anyway, so another question on the deferral of the North Kingstown secondary plan. I think this is being deferred like 3 times before. It keeps going 2 months, 3 months, and so on. And so I have a 2-part question. I see it's slotted for Q4 2021. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's the time. And so it's going to be more than a year deferred. And I'm wondering how that, secondary question, how that affects the status of the Wellington Street extension, because I think that's part of the tying up of all these studies in the downtown, or that study in the downtown.
Commissioner Agnew.
Thank you, and through you, your worship. Yes, we've had to make some adjustments to our work plan for the major policy work that's going on. And, you know, a lot of that has to do with the fact that the studies that we do are not just a result of land use planning thinking, that there's a lot of detailed technical analysis that goes on in the background with support from other departments, transportation services, for example, engineering, utilities, Kingston. And as we've transitioned through this time, and as Commissioner Hurdle CAO Hurdle has spoken to throughout this meeting today, is some of the readjustment of work that has had to take place based on COVID priorities coming up and taking staff capacity that was otherwise allocated to projects. So for North Kingstown specifically, again, because we're doing essentially 3 secondary plans at the same time, which also requires support from all of the same technical departments that also have requirements for their time based on COVID related work and other elements of their work plan, we essentially had to look at what we could get done and what was reasonable based on all the players that were at the table. And it's not just the planning department, it's multiple departments. So what we're proposing to focus on is finishing the work to do with Williamsville, because it's tied to the interim control bylaw that's currently in effect, finishing Central Kingston as well by the end of this year, ramping up the zoning bylaw to have that ready to go, and then giving us space to finish all of those pieces, which require technical support from engineering, utilities, and for transportation services to be able to finish them. And then being able to continue with North Kingstown in 2021 when the capacity of those departments, in addition to planning, are available to finish the work that needs to be done. So we've had to prioritize looking at different areas of the city. We have growth pressures in Williamsville that are a little bit higher priority, I would say, versus some of the other work, which I think North Kingstown will be a slower long-term secondary plan that we'll see build out over a number of years. But you are correct that the Wellington Street extension has formed a part of that secondary plan. So the finalization of that plan as it stands right now is projected to be finished at the end of 2021, with the understanding that we're finishing in the meantime 2 other secondary plans and working to finalize the second version of the zoning bylaw to bring forth to the public for consultation.
Good. Thank you for that very complete response. I appreciate it. I think it's obvious why I would want to know, because it keeps getting pushed on and has to get finished. Just in that line, I see the density by design is slotted for 2020 to 2023. When would be the next important date for that particular piece?
Mr. Agnew?
Thank you, and through you. The first bit is related to Williamsville specifically because we rolled the Williams update into the density by design exercise. So we're working to bring that information to the public either in June or early July. We're just finalizing the technical work for Williamsville specifically. We've suggested that the next phase of density by design would look at the central business district, lower part of Princess Street, in our core downtown, again, knowing that we've been facing some significant development pressures with different applications over the last several years and wanting to tackle that as a priority. But also we chose those areas too, in relationship to the question that you asked CAO Hurdle before about what are we doing to help things get going. You may recall through some of our earlier conversations on density by design, one of the key elements that we're bringing forward is this concept of green lighting development in the areas where we want to see them. So that exercise, or those two policy exercises, and we've had to break it into chunks based on different geographies in the city to tackle them strategically one at a time, is really how can we ensure that the policies for our downtown and Williamsville, where we've seen a lot of development pressure and where we need to continue to provide housing to support our post-secondary institutions as well, how can we get those policies through to council for consideration and decision as a strategy to help greenlight development in the city, and also as a way now within the COVID context to help stimulate the economy. So that's one of our strategies.
Great, thank you, and I appreciate that reference, which I did pick up, but put aside for the moment. So thank you for those responses. I appreciate them.
Okay, thank you. Next is Councillor Holland.
Thank you, and thanks so much for the presentation and for the report, and all the work obviously that's been going on, and we haven't had a chance to see you all, and thank you face to face. But we've been feeling lots of gratitude and hearing it from residents as well. I have one fairly small question. It's related to the, there's a reference, one of the capital projects being deferred is the lighting of pathways, and it's not specifically in the strategic priorities of council, so therefore it's not in the chart at the back, or at least I can't see where it fits in. So I'm curious about the timeline. And I guess the $3 million that is dedicated to lighting of pathways, just for context, I suppose, and clarification, refers to active transportation routes similar to the new one we have in Leroy Grant, the Leroy Grant pathway. Is that what that item refers to, but like citywide?
Mr. Kidd.
Through you, your worship. So that is actually a budget envelope. Council may recall that when the active transportation plan was originally developed, lighting for pathways was not included in the budget, overall budget for it. So when we brought the implementation plan forward, we created this envelope for that purpose. Because again, we recognize that lighting is important, particularly in the winter months when people are still actively out and using these pathways. So what we're recommending is simply deferring that spending into 2021 at this point. So there are 2 new pathways that we're developing, and we didn't see any harm in not actually spending that money. So that deferral is more of a benefit to our cash flow at this point in time.
Great. So then the timeline then, I guess, does that refer to, so it refers to spending the money. What will we be looking at in terms of completion timeline? Do you have any idea on that?
I'm sorry, I don't. I know that there are 2 projects, but that are scheduled to proceed. Both of them are linked to Utilities Kingston projects as well. So I don't have a defined timeline on those, Councillor, but we did not recommend them for deferral. So we plan to proceed with the pathways as soon as we can get the projects lined back up and get the work done. And then if the lighting had to come after the fact, we don't think that's going to be that problematic.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. I don't see any other questions. Yes, Councillor Stanek.
Okay, I'm good, right? Thank you very much, Your Worship. Thank you to staff for all the details in Exhibit B. They were a great help and they're very, very detailed. I have some questions for Exhibit D, which is the schedule for roads and for sidewalks. So other than like the parks and some of the projects mentioned specifically in the report, is it true then that everything else in Exhibit D will still be going on this year in 2020 for sidewalks and roads?
Commissioner Kidd.
Through you, Your Worship. So unfortunately, there was a column that was left off this exhibit that would have explained that. But as for all of the projects listed in the initial section under concrete, sidewalk, and bus paths, again, due to the nature of that work and having to be done in very close quarters with people working very closely together, all of that work that was scheduled for 2020 is now being deferred to 2021. The remaining projects on this list generally have no change to them as it relates to roads and road reconstruction and rehabilitation. However, they're not all 2020 projects. Some of them were slated to be 2021. So for example, King Street is a 2021 project. There's a few others on here. I'm happy to forward to council tomorrow the complete list with the timelines again that may actually help. Then into the parks projects, yes, there are some specific deferrals and those have been highlighted in the actual body of the report.
Okay, super. If we could get that, the revised list showing which projects are 2021, that's great. So we can advise our constituents if any of those projects happen to be in our district. And then I know that we have Jim Keach on the call too. And I just wanted to ask Mr. Keach about the Utilities Kingston water main work being done, that originally when we all met with city engineering in January, we all had one-on-ones as, you know, to do a synopsis of our district. And that's when some water main projects for our district were told to us that would be happening this year. And I just wondered from Mr. Keach if those projects will still be going on. Specifically for my district, I was told in January that Fleet Street and Wembley Place will be having water main work. And I just wondered if that will be happening, and even if there's a similar list to what engineering has provided us tonight, if there's a list that also could be sent to us showing which water main works might be deferred or if they're all going on this year still.
Mr. Keach.
Yeah, so through your worship, so we are actually publishing a list similar to what City Engineering has put out, and I think there's a press release going out about that before the end of the week. And I noted the councilor's request that I noticed that this morning and passed it on to staff. I think the specific projects that you are talking about will still continue ahead. There are some relining projects that are going to be canceled, and we're canceling them for the same reasons, budgetary concerns. The detailed information on that will be made available before the end of the week. I believe the ones that the councilor is asking for will still be presented.
Thank you very much. And I have a question for Commissioner Kidd. It's about the yard waste depot. And so right now on our city website, it says that we're doing drop-offs at Cartwright for yard waste up until May 31st on your garbage day. This week was a shortened week, and a lot of people in my district, they have garbage day on Friday. So does that mean they can go on Saturday, or can they still go on Friday as that was going to be their regular garbage day? How does it work when it's a shortened week with that new schedule we have for COVID?
Mr. Kidd.
Through you, your worship, our intent was that it would shift the same as your garbage day. So for Friday pickups that have shifted to Saturday, they would go to be able to access the site on Saturday.
All right, so it kind of means that Saturday's going to be really busy because everyone in the West End, Saturday was that extra day you could drop off anyway. And now everyone with Friday will also be on Saturday. So Saturday's going to be pretty busy because the weather's really nice. Everyone was gardening on the long weekend and they probably have tons of yard waste bags. So does it look like maybe for June then we're going to go back to regular where the yard waste depot could be open every Saturday for June? Is that what it's looking at? Like we're doing the 4-bag garbage limit changeover mid-June. So what's the plan for yard waste?
We haven't got a solid date yet for yard waste, but we have been working with our contractor and looking at ways that we can help to encourage some of the social distancing recommendations. And recognizing that, yes, this is the time of year when that service is in demand. And we will definitely be taking a look at that. We should be able to get some information out to council on that, I would say by mid next week.
All right, great. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much. I don't see any other questions. So at this point, thank you, CAO Hurdle. We will now move to report number 43 from the CAO.
Moved by Councillor Stroud, seconded by Councillor McLaren, that report number 43 from the Chief Administrative Officer recommend be received and adopted.
So there is just the one clause, COVID-19 response update, operational and financial impacts. Is there any discussion? Okay, seeing none, then we will call the vote. All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Thank you. Okay, moving on. We have 2 new motions. And so I will hand the chair over to Deputy Mayor Neil to take us through that.
Thank you very much. And I do indeed have the motion in front of me this time. So moved by Mayor Patterson, seconded by Councillor Bohm. Whereas the social and financial impacts related to the global COVID-19 pandemic have been felt significantly throughout the Kingston community, and whereas residents, businesses, and community organizations are struggling to make ends meet and have an expectation that their elected officials are looking for ways to conserve spending while focusing on recovery efforts. And whereas the CAO and City Treasurer have presented a COVID-19 financial impact report to Council detailing impacts to city operations and services that reflect a current deficit of $4 million that continues to grow. And whereas the impacts of COVID have resulted in municipal layoffs in several city departments, including members currently, including cultural and recreation, and a freeze on all non-union salaries for 2020. And whereas council members currently receive a cost of living increase to their salaries on an annual basis, and whereas if we as a council are looking to our city administration to make the necessary and tough financial decisions to maintain the services residents expect, then we as a council need to do our part to contribute to the city's financial stability. Therefore, be it resolved that the city treasurer be directed to eliminate the cost of living increase for members of council effective December 1st, 2020 for 2021. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. So we've just spent the last couple of hours asking questions and discussing the staff report detailing all of the tough decisions that have had to be made. And of course, we've talked about some of the decisions that councils had to make to defer certain projects, but there are a number of difficult, I would go so far as to say gut-wrenching staffing decisions that CAO Hurdle and her team have had to make to deal with the deficit that we are confronted with. I certainly commend her and her team for doing everything they could to limit the number of layoffs. I know that there are a larger number of layoffs that have had to occur in other cities, but quite frankly, every layoff is tremendously difficult. So I know that there's been some tough decisions about trying to cut costs wherever possible, and asking all non-union employees to freeze their wages, so that again to save dollars. And so this motion is essentially to bring us as members of council in line with that. I think it's only right that if we are asking our other city employees to freeze their salaries, then we should do the same thing. And so that effectively is the nature of what this motion is about. It is just to show that solidarity. The one thing that I will say, and I appreciate Councillor McLaren raising this point earlier this afternoon, is that of course our cost of living increase would be tied to what the inflation rate would be as of this October. And that there is a risk of deflation and what that would mean. So I have discussed it with staff, but I am comfortable with the wording that we have, and I'll explain why. You'll see that the motion is to eliminate a cost of living increase. Just to be clear, if there was deflation, it would be a cost of living decrease. And since the motion is not asking to eliminate a cost of living decrease, I've spoken with staff, it would be interpreted that if that was the case, that in fact we would have a cost of living decrease if that was to occur. Otherwise, it is to effectively freeze our salary in the presence of inflation, again in line with what we're asking from our non-union employees. So with that, certainly happy to take any questions or comments from council, but I certainly hope that we can take this step and again show that everyone here at the city is going to take those steps to try to deal with the financial challenges that we're faced with. Thank you.
Thank you. The floor is now open for any questions or comments from anybody. Yes, Councillor Chappelle, and then Councillor Hutchison.
I realize that it's small in comparison to the unfortunate circumstances of some of the residents that don't have public sector pensions and what have you. Maybe it's also a good opportunity to reflect on the structure of council going forward and perhaps reduce the size of council.
Is that a question for me, Councillor?
Anyone who wishes to answer.
Could I suggest, since I am chairing, I'm going to take advantage of that. Can I suggest that if that's a consideration that isn't related to the motion before us, however, with a seconder, you can always bring that forward to council in the form of a motion. Thank you very much. Any further questions? Yes, Councillor Hutchison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to support this motion. It's not the first time we've done it when we've had difficulties at the city and the economy. And the main thing is that as a organization, we're expecting sacrifices and commitments from our own employees, as is happening in the population in general, and that we should show some, I believe, some leadership by indicating that we are also willing to do those things as well as the things we're doing as individuals and as councillors. I was a bit concerned with the information that it might not affect everybody equally because incomes are different. But I think in the interpretation of the motion that it would be a freeze, basically. That's the way I interpret it. And I see the mayor nodding. So that's the agreed interpretation. And so I think that at least addresses that other issue I just mentioned, as well as we can expect to do it and still do it. So again, I would encourage everyone to vote for this and try to hold together our solidarity as a community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Any further questions? I just had one quick comment, if I could. Yes.
Sorry,
Mayor Patterson.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I just see that Councillor Stroud has his hand raised.
Oh, I missed that. I apologize. Councillor Stroud, floor is yours.
Sorry, are we questions for the mover, or is this comments as well?
Comments, and if you have a question for the mover, the chair will.
Actually, I have a question for staff about the ramifications of the motion. So just so we can put it all in perspective. So the deficit, as explained by the CAO, of $4 million, compared to the annual budget of around 500 million, is that correct? Are those numbers more or less correct? 4 million and 500 million?
I believe perhaps Ms. Kennedy could answer that.
Yes, that's correct.
So we're looking at a projected deficit for this so far, from what we have from our estimates from the CAO, of less than 1% of the annual budget. And as a remedy, we're proposing freezing our salaries. What percentage of the budget would that entail?
Again, Ms. Kennedy, I almost gave you a demotion. Ms. Kennedy might have the answer to that.
Thank you. Through you. So depending on what the percentage might be, council remuneration in total is about $750,000 a year. So just based on say a standard 2% increase for CPI would be about $15,000.
15,000 versus the 4 million projected deficit. I agree with the basic premise that every little bit helps. And so 15,000 versus 4 million, every little bit helps. I guess it's a good idea, but it's nowhere near what we need to be doing as a council as far as the difficult decisions. The difficult decisions have to do with what 1% of city spending can we defer or cancel, not little window dressing things like $15,000 of our own salary. That's my opinion. I won't oppose the motion, but I just put it into perspective. Thank you.
Yes, Councillor Bone.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor, and through you. Just, I mean, in speaking with Mayor Patterson about this this motion, when we were discussing it was never about the actual dollar amount itself, to my understanding, and the intention essentially behind it is simply to show that solidarity, that teamwork. If we're asking everybody else to make sacrifices, I mean, do you dive in and just cut it all out of one department, or do you try to go to each little bit and have everybody tighten their belts a little bit so that you kind of spread the pain out? So this is more just our contribution. It's a drop in the bucket, but after many, many drops in the bucket, we'll hopefully find that $4.5 or $5 million, whatever it comes to in the end. And this was also more about just showing that we are all in this together. And if we're asking other people to defer their cost of living increases, then we should also not be accepting it. So it's that solidarity behind it to show that we're also willing to do the same things that we're basically expecting of others. So it's, I mean, if you want to get up and compare dollar values in the grand scheme of things, I mean, we can do that all day, but it was more the intent of the motion was essentially to just show that solidarity and that we're willing to do what everybody else is being asked to do at the same time.
Thank you. Seeing no other hands up, I will ask Councillor Kiley to take the chair if you would.
I take the chair and recognize you, Councillor Neal.
Thank you very much. I just want to quickly say, yes, this is symbolic. I never want to say merely symbolic. I spent my career as a literature teacher and as a drama teacher. So symbols are important. And I also want to remind people that in the 2 times in the last 11 years when the discussion of our salary came up, I was opposed to the idea of a cost of living allowance. I supported the motions that were recommended by the community group that was struck, but it is unfortunate, I think, that we're the only group on the city payroll that has a cost of living allowance. Our union and our non-union workers and all of our workers throughout the community do not have a cost of living allowance. So for those reasons, I think it's easy for me to support this motion. And if need be, when we're asking our city workers, both union and non-union, to give up as much as they may end up giving up, maybe we need to revisit this and reconsider it. I know we're all working harder now. I have more Zoom meetings and more hours between planning and council and other committees, commitments, but I think this is a motion that shows the community that yes, it's a drop in the bucket, but we're willing to make this gesture in this really difficult time. So I totally support the motion. Thank you.
I yield the chair to you.
Thank you. Have I stirred anybody to want to speak? I guess not. I see nobody. So would you like to say anything in conclusion as the mover? Seeing a shake of the head, I will call the question. All those in favor? And it's carried unanimously. Thank you. So I return the chair.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I'm actually going to ask you to take the chair one more time for the second motion that we have on the addeds. Again, since I'm the mover, that would be
no problem. I was trying to give me time to find it on my phone here, so I can now read it. Whereas the government, moved by Mayor Patterson, seconded by Deputy Mayor Neal, whereas the governments of Canada and Ontario have been working cooperatively throughout the COVID-19 crisis to support Canadians, and whereas the governments of Canada and Ontario have worked swiftly to provide urgent relief to people and businesses to lay a foundation for future economic recovery, and whereas Ontario municipalities like Kingston are facing plummeting revenues and surging costs as we work to protect public health and maintain critical services. And whereas Kingston City Council recently received a report from the city treasurer that identifies a $4 million funding gap related to COVID that continues to grow. And whereas the large Urban Mayors Caucus of Ontario, LUMCO, represents Ontario's 20 largest cities with nearly 70% of Ontario's population, of which Kingston is a member. And whereas LUMCO members are pleased that the Premier and the Prime Minister have said Ontario and Canada will be at the table to support municipalities. And whereas the governments of Canada and Ontario have greater fiscal capacity and tools than municipalities to provide relief in this crisis, and whereas LUMCO has urged the federal and provincial governments to support municipalities with a 3-point plan that includes immediate relief, medium-term recovery, and long-term reform. And whereas the city also supports the Federation of Canadian Municipalities' call for federal emergency operating funding, therefore be it resolved, the city encourages and supports the call from FCM and LUMCO to encourage the federal and provincial governments to provide immediate financial relief to municipalities for COVID-19 related expenses and lost revenues in a manner which is similar to other programs already fully 100% funded by the governments of Canada and Ontario to support individuals and businesses throughout the COVID-19 crisis. So I will recognize you as the mover.
Great. Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. I made a comment a little bit earlier in our meeting about the discussions that are happening among mayors across the province. And so we have had discussions about the ask from Canada city mayors, supported by FCM, asking for this assistance. All of the mayors in Ontario have also supported this call. And so this motion before us is essentially just a show of unity. So these motions are being presented to other cities of our size or larger across the province. I think that the more cities that speak in one voice, the clearer the message that we are able to get to the province and the federal government. And so that's effectively the purpose for this motion. LUMCO has already passed a motion as a whole, but having the individual cities and having individual councils also do that, I think will add extra weight to the discussions that we are having with the province. So certainly hope that council can support it.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions or comments? I don't see any hands. So I will go back to the mover. If there's anything you wish to add, seeing none, I will call the question. All those in favor? And again, carried unanimously. Thank you. And I return the chair.
Great. Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. So with that, we have nothing else on our agenda except for bylaws. So Clerk Glasser, bylaws, please.
Moved by Councillor Kiley, seconded by Councillor Holland, that bylaw 1 be given its first and second reading.
All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried.
Moved by Councillor Doherty, seconded by Councillor Hill, that bylaw 1 be given its third reading.
All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Can I have a motion to adjourn, please? Moved by Councillor Bohm, seconded by Councillor Osanek. All those in favor? Opposed? And that's carried. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a great evening.